You know those moments that arrive unannounced and change everything? I'm still processing what happened. Picture one of those mornings where the world hasn't quite woken up and reality feels softer around the edges. That's when my neighbor's grandson appeared in my kitchen before sunrise, and what unfolded next shifted my entire perspective on connection, possibility, and myself. But first, I'm curious, where are you tuning in from right now? I've heard from viewers in Arizona, Vermont, even folks down in Florida joining these conversations, and knowing where you're listening makes this feel like we're sharing stories across a kitchen table. And if this is your first time here, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and leave a like. It truly helps, and it makes me feel like we're building something together. Alright, let's dive in. The morning everything changed, I woke earlier than my alarm. It must have been close to 5:30 because daylight hadn't reached the windows yet, but the birds were already singing their quiet dawn chorus. Those delicate, optimistic sounds that only exist in those first moments of morning. Sleep has been elusive lately. Perhaps it's getting older, perhaps it's living alone, or perhaps my thoughts simply refuse to settle anymore. So I wandered into the kitchen in my worn navy robe, the one with the flower print on the pockets, and started brewing coffee. The aroma filled the space before the light did, comforting, robust, grounding. I stood at the counter watching the first soft blush of sunrise creep along the window frame. It's remarkable how mornings can feel simultaneously vast and intimate in those early hours. My husband passed away 9 years ago. Cardiac arrest, completely unexpected, no warning signs. And my son relocated to Portland last year. So now it's just me moving through this old house that once vibrated with conversation and disagreements, and music echoing from upstairs. I certainly didn't expect company, especially not in my kitchen before dawn. But then I heard it. The creak of the back door. I froze, cup suspended halfway to my mouth. Initially I thought perhaps the wind, but then came footsteps, cautious, careful, like someone avoiding disturbing the stillness. And then he appeared. Daniel, my neighbor's grandson. 27, perhaps 28 now. I hadn't seen much of him since he'd left for university. Back then he was all awkward height and quiet grins, always volunteering to help with yard work or carrying packages when his grandmother sent him over. But the person who stepped into my kitchen that morning was transformed. Taller, more solid, the kind of presence that fills a room before you fully register it. "Miss Porter," he said, voice low and slightly uncertain. "I didn't mean to startle you." I exhaled, laughing softly, the sound landing somewhere between shock and comfort. "Daniel, you nearly stopped my heart. What brings you here at this hour?" He rubbed the back of his neck, looking somewhat embarrassed. "Gran locked herself out last night. I came to get the spare key you keep for her. I tried knocking, but I guess you didn't hear." That made perfect sense. I keep a spare for their house ever since his grandmother, my neighbor and closest friend Margaret, started misplacing things. Keys, appointments, names. She's only slightly older than me, but watching her memory fade has been difficult. "Well," I said, smiling and gesturing toward the counter, "you might as well have coffee before you leave. It's freshly made." He hesitated briefly, then nodded, stepping closer. The window light caught his features. Defined jaw, eyes still gentle, but deeper somehow, like he'd witnessed more in those years away. He sat across from me at the small kitchen table, and for several moments we didn't speak, just the clock ticking and the coffee maker humming its familiar rhythm. "You ever notice," he said eventually, staring into his cup, "how everything feels more truthful before the world wakes up? Like the air is more genuine somehow." That caught me unprepared. I'd never considered it that way, but he was absolutely right. I nodded. "Yes, it's peaceful enough to hear your own thoughts." He looked up at me then, and for a moment there was something in his expression that I couldn't quite identify. Not attraction, not yet, but deeply authentic. Like he perceived beyond the protective layers I'd constructed against loneliness. That kind of recognition can disarm you before you realize what's happening. We talked for quite a while. About his work downtown, about returning home to support his grandmother as her memory deteriorated, about how disorienting it felt being back. He told me he'd ended an engagement last year, said he didn't feel truly understood anymore. That phrase lingered between us. Understood. It's interesting how being truly seen can feel both frightening and essential. The sky outside brightened gradually, pouring amber through the curtains, and I noticed his hands wrapped around his cup, steady, warm, capable. I wondered when someone had last sat across from me in this kitchen, talking like that, openly. The house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. I found myself sharing things I hadn't planned. I told him how silent the evenings felt, how I missed being essential to someone, about how I sometimes kept the television running just for background voices. He listened, not the performative listening people do while waiting their turn to speak, but genuinely listened, eyes focused, expression soft. There was a pause then, and something shifted in the atmosphere, the kind of moment that hovers at the edge of transformation, where you can almost sense the balance tipping. He stood up, moving toward the counter to refill his cup, and when he passed behind me, I felt his warmth, caught his scent, soap, coffee, something fresh and unfamiliar, and suddenly breathing became difficult. He didn't touch me, didn't speak. But when he turned back, our eyes met again, and there was recognition there. Mutual, tender, unexpected. "Thanks," he said quietly, "for the coffee and for listening." "Any time," I replied, my voice barely audible. He lingered a moment longer before stepping out into the pale morning. The door clicked shut, and the house fell still again, but something inside me had transformed. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was full. I stood there staring at the empty cup across from me and thought about how connection can discover you when you least anticipate it. How a moment that begins with a knock on the back door can awaken something long dormant inside you. That morning, as the sun climbed higher and the coffee grew cold, I realized something I hadn't in years. I wasn't invisible. Not anymore. And that was only the beginning. The next morning, I found myself waking before the alarm again, though I hadn't slept much anyway. There was something about that dawn encounter that kept replaying in my mind like a favorite song. Daniel's quiet voice, the way he looked at me as if the years between us were irrelevant, the sense of warmth that remained long after he'd left. I told myself it was foolish to dwell on it so much. But sometimes the things we can't rationalize are the ones that refuse to release us. I made my coffee the same way, 2 spoons of sugar, a splash of milk, and tried to focus on the day ahead. But as I stood by the window overlooking the fence dividing our yards, I saw him again. He was outside helping his grandmother with her garden. Even from that distance, I could tell he was exhausted. His movements were deliberate, protective, like every action carried the burden of responsibility. Margaret waved when she noticed me watching. I waved back, smiling, but my gaze drifted back to Daniel as he straightened up and stretched. The early light brushed across his face, catching the edges of his hair, and I could almost feel the same quiet energy that had filled my kitchen yesterday. Something gentle, something kind. At mid-morning there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find him standing there holding a small basket of tomatoes and herbs. "Gran insisted we share," he said, grinning a little. "She says you always cook better with her garden produce." I laughed, stepping aside to let him in. "She's absolutely right about that. Come on, I'll make something with them. You have time for lunch?" He hesitated just a second before nodding. "Sure, if you don't mind the company." "I'd enjoy the company," I said, realizing it was completely true. As I chopped the tomatoes and stirred them into a pan, he leaned against the counter like he'd done it countless times before. We talked again, this time about lighter subjects. Music, his favorite films, the travels he'd taken before returning home. It felt natural, effortless, the kind of conversation that flows without friction. Every now and then, though, there were moments of quiet between us. Soft pauses that hummed with something unspoken. I could feel him observing me, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me self-aware again, aware of the small details I'd long stopped noticing. The way I tucked my hair behind my ear, the lines at the corners of my mouth when I smiled. At one point, as I reached for a towel, our hands brushed. Just a passing touch, barely anything. But I was startled by how immediate it felt, how electric. We both froze, then laughed it off, pretending it was nothing. Yet, as I turned back to the stove, I could feel the echo of it linger in the air like a pulse. After lunch, we sat at the table while the afternoon sunlight poured across the floor. He told me about his grandmother's forgetfulness worsening, how she sometimes asked where his grandfather was, though he'd passed away years ago. I could see the pain behind his eyes. That kind of exhaustion doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from caring too much, too deeply, for too long. I reached across the table, placing my hand gently over his. "You're doing right by her, Daniel," I said. "I know it isn't easy." He nodded, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. "Sometimes it helps to just talk," he murmured. "You listen differently than most people, like you actually hear." I smiled. "Maybe that's just experience. You learn not to rush through silence." He looked at me then, really looked, and the moment seemed to stretch. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just a quiet recognition between two people who'd found something familiar in each other. I pulled my hand back slowly, not because I wanted to, but because I was afraid of what might develop if I didn't. That evening, after he left, I stood on the porch and watched the light fade behind the trees. The neighborhood was calm, the air warm and still. Across the yard, I could see the faint glow from Margaret's kitchen window, and I imagined Daniel there, moving gently around his grandmother, patient and kind. And I thought about myself, how long it had been since someone had filled my day, so simply, without expectation or pretense. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was connection, the kind that reminds you you're still capable of feeling something new, even after years of thinking your story had already been written. Later that night, I sat with a glass of wine and tried to read, but the words on the page blurred. My mind kept drifting back to the small moments. His laugh, his steady eyes, the warmth of his hand beneath mine. I wondered if he was thinking about them too, or if I was just letting my imagination wander like it used to when I was younger. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Thanks for today," it read. "It felt good to talk. Haven't done that in a while." I stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering above the screen before I typed back. "Me too. You're welcome anytime." When I set the phone down, I realized I was smiling. Not the polite smile I'd learned to wear for the world, but a genuine one. Soft, uncertain, hopeful, and for the first time in years, I slept through the night. The next few days he came by again, sometimes to borrow a tool, sometimes just to sit for a while. The rhythm of it became natural, like a quiet thread stitching our mornings together. We didn't need to discuss what it meant. It was enough to just be, to share a cup of coffee, to listen, to exist side by side. But something inside me knew it couldn't stay that way forever. Because when two people begin to understand each other that deeply, when comfort turns into awareness and awareness into something warmer, life has a way of testing what it's built. And soon it would. It was the third morning in a row that I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed softly against the walls and let you hear your own breathing. I went through the familiar motions, coffee, robe, slippers, but my heart had a rhythm that didn't belong to habit anymore. It belonged to something else. I didn't plan to see him that day, but sometimes life doesn't wait for plans. Around 6, while I was watering the little row of herbs by the window, I noticed movement outside. Daniel again, though this time he wasn't in his yard. He was standing near my fence, looking at something on the ground. His shirt was damp at the collar, his hair uncombed. He looked like someone who hadn't slept either. I stepped out onto the porch, mug in hand. "You're up early?" I called softly. He turned, smiling faintly. "Could say the same for you. What brings you over?" He hesitated, then laughed quietly, running a hand through his hair. "Gran's sleeping in. I just needed, I don't know, a moment." "Come in," I said before I could stop myself. "Coffee's fresh." He didn't argue. The morning light poured through the kitchen like honey, painting everything in a slow, golden warmth. We sat again at the table, the same place where everything had started. For a while we didn't say much, just sipped coffee and watched the steam curl between us. It felt like we were both waiting for the other to speak first. Finally he said, "You ever feel like time moves differently around certain people? Like everything else slows down a little?" I met his gaze. "Yes," I said quietly. "I know exactly what you mean." He nodded, almost relieved to hear it. There was a stillness in the air then, not empty, but full, like the world was holding its breath. The sun crept higher, the clock ticked softly, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out once before going silent again. He leaned back in his chair, eyes tracing the rim of his mug. "It's strange," he said. "I come here and it feels like I can finally think straight, like I can breathe again." "That's what a home is supposed to do," I replied. "Maybe," he said, glancing up at me, "but it's not my house that feels that way." Something inside me shifted, a mix of warmth and concern. I wanted to say something sensible, to remind him about boundaries and age and what the world might think. But the truth was, I felt it too. That quiet pull, that peace that came when he was near. We didn't speak for a long time after that. Words would have only broken the calm. Instead, we just sat there, two people from different chapters of life, finding something steady in the same silence. Eventually, I stood up to refill the pot. My hand trembled slightly, and I told myself it was just the heat from the stove. But when I turned, he was watching me, really watching, the way he had that first morning. Not with longing or confusion, but with understanding, with respect. He got up slowly, stepping closer, and for a heartbeat I could feel the nearness of him, the quiet energy that filled the space between us. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. It was enough just to stand there side by side, the morning light resting on our shoulders like a secret. "Daniel," I said softly, breaking the silence. "You should get some rest. You've been carrying too much lately." He nodded, eyes still on mine. "Maybe I have, but it doesn't feel heavy here." Then, almost as if he was afraid to say more, he turned toward the door. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me be here." "Always," I answered. After he left, I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty chair. I thought about what he'd said, how time felt different, and I realized he was right. The hours we shared weren't ordinary. They had a weight, a rhythm all their own. Over the next week, he came by often, sometimes in the afternoons, sometimes at dawn. Each time our conversations deepened, about his fears, his hopes, the things neither of us had said out loud to anyone else. I told him about my husband, how losing him had left a silence that never really faded. He told me about his own losses, the dreams that didn't work out, the people who'd left when life got too hard. In those talks, something tender began to take shape. Not romance, not quite. Something gentler. A bond built out of honesty and quiet trust. The kind of connection that sneaks up on you when you stop trying to name it. One afternoon, we sat on the back steps, watching the light move across the garden. Margaret's voice drifted faintly from her porch, humming a tune from decades past. The air smelled of lavender and approaching rain. He said, "You know, my grandfather used to sit like this, just staring at the sky, saying it helped him remember what mattered." "And what mattered to him?" I asked. He smiled a little. "Being kind, staying present, not running from what scares you." I nodded, feeling that wisdom settle deep inside me. "That's good advice," I said, "for anyone." He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that said everything words couldn't. "Maybe that's why I like being here," he said quietly. "You remind me of that." The evening air grew cooler then, brushing against my skin. I could feel the truth of his words settle between us. Gentle, grounding, real. When he finally stood to leave, he didn't say goodbye. He just gave a small nod, a promise in his eyes that this wasn't the end of whatever had begun. And as the sun disappeared behind the hills, I sat there alone, but not lonely. For the first time in years, the silence around me felt like comfort instead of emptiness. Something was changing, and deep down I knew neither of us would be able to ignore it much longer. The morning of the storm started quietly. The air was heavy, the sky the color of steel, and even the birds seemed uncertain whether to sing. I remember standing by the window, coffee cup in hand, watching the first streaks of gray stretch across the yard. It felt like a pause before something significant. Margaret had been having a difficult week. Daniel had mentioned it the night before when he dropped by to return a baking dish. He looked more tired than usual, and there was a weight in his voice when he said, "Gran had one of her moments today. Forgot where she was for almost an hour." I'd put a hand on his shoulder, just for a second, and told him to call if he needed anything. I didn't know that by morning he would. The rain began before sunrise, a steady tapping that grew into a drumbeat against the roof. Around 6, my phone rang. It was Daniel. "She's scared," he said, voice frayed at the edges. "She doesn't recognize the house right now. I think she needs someone besides me." "I'm coming," I said, already pulling on my coat. When I arrived, Margaret was sitting on the couch, eyes darting between us, frightened and small. Daniel knelt beside her, patient, his hand resting gently on hers. He looked up when I came in, relief softening his face. "Hey," I said, crouching beside her. "It's just me, Margaret. You're home. Everything's all right." It took a while, but she started to calm. Her breathing steadied, and after a few minutes, she let Daniel guide her back to bed. When he returned, he leaned against the doorway, exhaustion written all over him. "She's asleep," he murmured. I nodded. "You need rest too." He shook his head, sitting heavily at the kitchen table. "Can't. I keep thinking, if she forgets me again, what happens then?" I sat across from him, pouring 2 cups of tea. The storm outside deepened, wind brushing against the windows. The air between us was quiet, but charged with a kind of understanding that didn't need words. "You're doing everything you can," I said. "Sometimes that has to be enough." He looked at me then, eyes tired but full of something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or just the comfort of being seen. "You've been there for both of us," he said softly. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to," I replied. "That's what neighbors do. That's what friends do." But when I said it, the word friends caught in my throat, because by then we both knew what lived between us wasn't just friendship anymore. It wasn't romantic in the way people imagine when they're young, but it was real. Something quiet, steady, and undeniable. The power flickered then, the light dimming before snapping back to life. Daniel laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "This house feels smaller in storms," he said. "So does mine," I replied, smiling faintly. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. "Do you ever wish you could go back to when things were simpler?" I thought about that for a long time before answering. "No," I said finally. "Back then, I didn't understand how much moments like this mattered, the quiet ones, the hard ones, the ones that make you stop and feel something again." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening just a little as he swallowed whatever emotion was rising. We stayed like that for a while, just sitting, listening to the rain, the storm wrapping the house in its gray hum. At one point, he reached across the table and took my hand. Not in question, not in hesitation, just a steady human gesture. Warm, grounded. I didn't pull away. There were no words after that. We didn't need any. His thumb brushed lightly across my fingers once, and for a moment time did that strange thing again. It slowed, stretched, became endless. When the storm finally broke and the light returned, everything seemed sharper. The air smelled of rain and earth and new beginnings. I stood, smoothing my sleeve, and said, "You should get some sleep now. You'll need your strength." He smiled faintly. "Will you stay just for a bit till the rain stops?" And so I did. We sat there in silence, watching droplets slide down the window. 2 people bound not by circumstance or expectation, but by something quieter. A shared understanding that life is fragile, that kindness is rare, and that sometimes connection finds you in the most ordinary places. When I finally walked home that afternoon, the storm had passed. The neighborhood smelled of wet grass and clean air. I looked up at the sky, streaked with pale light, and felt something settle inside me. A peace I hadn't known in years. Later that evening, as I stood at my kitchen window again, I saw Daniel on his porch waving. I waved back. No words, no promises, just a knowing look between us. Some stories don't need endings. They just shift quietly into the fabric of your days. That's what this was. Not a grand romance, not a confession whispered in the dark, but something far simpler. It was a reminder that even at 59, with lines tracing the years across my hands, life still holds the power to surprise me, to awaken me, to remind me that connection isn't about age or timing. It's about presence. That morning when Daniel first walked into my kitchen at dawn, I thought it was just another strange, fleeting moment, but now I know it was the start of remembering myself, and for that I'll always be grateful.